Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, I review the vintage 50mm f2.8 Leitz Elmar lens, which was produced between 1957 and 1962 for the screw-mount version, and all the way up until 1972 for the Leica M bayonet version. And in those roughly 15 years, over 70,000 units were produced, and of course the majority for the Leica M mount. This lens here is known for its classic appearance and its collapsibility, and this particular version here is already an improvement that was made possible through new lanthanum crown glass that came with all sorts of corrections, and of course the wider aperture of f2.8 in comparison to the original Elmar lens, the f3.5 lens from 1926. In terms of versions, it's also very important to differentiate this lens here from the newer version, the reissue version, so to speak, that was released in 1994, together with the Leica M6J, a special version. That newer version then came in black and silver, and also with less aperture blades. We will get to that in a minute, so please don't confuse these two lenses. We're looking at the vintage Leitz Elmar version here. What is also important about this lens is its low price point. So these lenses can typically be had for 300 to 400 euro. You get an original Leitz lens that was produced to the kind of quality that is not common anymore. And the only real downside of this lens is its minimum focusing distance of 1 meter, but there's even an adapter for that lets you get closer to the subject. Again, we will get to that in a minute. And if you don't mind that, it's a really interesting lens in my opinion. And to be honest, I was personally drawn to this lens because I just wanted to review it. And because it was so inexpensive, I jumped at the opportunity to try it, but then realized it's really an interesting lens, and I'm not really into selling it now because I really enjoy using it. Because of the compact form factor of this lens and its collapsibility, I took it with me on all sorts of recent trips. So I had it with me during a short layover in Hong Kong, where I shot one roll of Ilford FP4. Then I took it with me 2 trips to Lucerne and Zurich in Switzerland. I'm also shooting FP4 and APX 200. And then I also had it with me on a recent trip to Milan, like a long weekend where I got the chance to shoot some Leica Monopan 50 and some Kodak Gold 200, so some color film as well. And as always, these films were developed and scanned by my trusted On Film Lab in Frankfurt. Let's dive in there. The 50mm f2.8 Elmar comes with the same classic 4 elements and 3 groups design of the original, and also the aperture located behind the first element. This simple design also creates high serviceability, so it is relatively easy to service and maintain this lens, which of course adds to the stability in terms of its price point. The lens weighs only 220 grams and protrudes around 36 millimeters from the camera when expanded, and only 21 millimeters when collapsed. And personally, especially in combination with the classic lens cap, it looks beautiful on a black Leica M6 or M42, or also the MP of course. And originally it was naturally made for the Leica M3 and the M2, so the period correct cameras, and here the shiny chrome perfectly matches. So if you're looking for a lens that perfectly fits the original M3 for instance, I would highly recommend going in this direction here as well. What is truly special about this lens is that it comes with 15 aperture blades that let you stop down from the f2.8 all the way down to f16. And what is remarkable about the 15 aperture blades is that the aperture remains round, perfectly round across all the stops, and that of course positively affects the bokeh and the general look of the images. And this is also an important difference to the later version of this lens from the 1990s and 2000s, because that came with only 6 aperture blades, so quite a difference here, and you can really feel the quality of these 15 aperture blades in this particular lens here. The minimum focusing distance is 1 meter, but Leitz introduced a special adapter called the Suki M adapter that creates both the right distance from the film plane and features some goggles to get as close as 0.5 meters to your subject with the Elmar, and the adapter can often be had for around 50 or 55 euro, so yeah, it is quite accessible. Another important detail is that there are different versions of this lens, and the first ones from 1957 to 1960 come with either inscriptions for feet or meters, depending on the target market, and the later versions, like mine here from 1961, come with both feet and meters. So if that is important to you, that you either want a particularly clean one with only your distance scale, then you can hunt down for one particularly old one. Or you should just be aware the later ones come with both, and you shouldn't be surprised. But how does this lens perform optically? The original f3.5 version of this lens is known to only offer center sharpness and then deteriorate rather quickly and become very soft towards the corners of the frame. This improved and corrected version, the f2.8 version in contrast, offers a very good and solid performance across the entire frame. Even when shot wide open at f2.8, you can feel that it's a little bit overstretched arguably, but once you stop down to f4 and beyond, you get a really nice solid performer that offers a lot of micro contrast, a lot of sharpness, and even the color rendering was beautiful in my opinion. And this lens, even back then, was performing on par once you stop down to f5.6 and definitely at f8, on par with the contemporary Summicron. And this is also mentioned in the Leica Pocketbook, and I can testify to that with my own experience when shooting this lens. This is a really nice lens that, in my opinion, is optically often overlooked because of its looks, because it really reminds everyone of these 1920s and 1930s Elmar lenses, the collapsible design, the overall cosmetic look, and people immediately jump to the conclusion that this is probably not a well-corrected, not well-coated lens, and assume all these downsides that are actually not there. For me, this is a classic 1960s vintage rendering, a beautiful look that offers surprisingly much correction and sharpness. And it's actually the kind of look that many reissue lenses today are aiming for. And this here is the original, with an original Leitz's lens for 300 to 400 euro, and in my opinion a pretty good deal. The out of focus areas, both in the foreground and in the background, are beautiful, and you get a pretty pleasing bokeh in most situations, in regular use at least. There are certain backgrounds, if they become particularly busy, you also have some bubbles in the background with sharper onion rings around them. I could force that effect here and there, but in regular use, as said, I had a really nice and pleasing bokeh, at least to my taste. Of course, when you're shooting against reflections in the sun, you do get some, it's not particularly well controlled, so you do get some ghosting and flaring effects, but again, personally I really like that, and this is also what I expect from such a lens. Please note that the optical performance will suffer if you have a lens that suffers from internal haze. So you have to understand that back then in the 1950s and 60s, Leitz's used special lubricants that outgas over time. And the problem here is that the chemical residue settles directly onto the internal glass elements, and because the rear element group is pretty close or right next to the helicoid grease, it is incredibly common to have the chemical residue kind of interact with the grease, and as a result of that you get a lot of cloudy films inside these lens elements that can only be cleaned by a professional technician, of course. And if that is the case for your lens, you will definitely see problems with the micro contrast, the sharpness, and so on. So when purchasing this lens, do yourself a favor and do the classic flashlight test. So open the lens up, remove basically the front and rear element, and take a flashlight and shine through it and see whether you can see any internal haze and any problems. If you are purchasing it off eBay and other sources, maybe reach out to the seller and ask them to do that for you, because otherwise you will have a CLA of this lens. If it's perfectly fine, you will have a lens that performs surprisingly well optically, and since these lenses are available in such abundance, you will often find lenses that have been serviced already and that are still in use and still work perfectly fine. So it is worth observing the market for a longer period of time instead of making a compromise and purchasing one that suffers from these problems. So once it's mentioning somewhere tiny in a description that it suffers from internal haze, I would steer away from it or calculate in some CLA. So what about the handling and my personal impressions? The most important point is that when focusing this lens, the entire helicoid is turning, which naturally creates problems when changing the aperture afterwards, because then the whole lens is turning again and changing the focus. So my personal workaround is to leave the lens at infinity using the infinity lock and then changing the aperture to fit my exposure first and to fit the impression of the image that I want to create, and only then start focusing afterwards. People coming from a regular Leica M lens might notice that immediately, that this is a change of thinking, because many people, as I've observed, focus first and then change the aperture. And of course that does not cause any problems because the focusing typically remains the same. In this case here, this is the only downside, so to speak, that you really need to get used to it, that it's turning the whole helicoid. To be fair, it has two aperture scales, one on the top and one on the bottom, to kind of rectify that problem and make it always accessible and readable, regardless of where you are. And that also means that, of course, it's not that easy to have muscle memory for the aperture, so you need to get used to that the entire thing is turning. The lens is fully collapsible on all Leica M film cameras. For digital cameras, the safe zones differ depending on the camera model apparently, so it is mostly collapsible, but I would always recommend double checking to make sure that you're not damaging any internal components or even the sensor. So please check twice before collapsing this lens on a digital camera. What I also find remarkable is the look that the large number of aperture blades create. As mentioned, a beautiful bokeh and quite a lot of look and feeling to the images for the money. And as I've stated before, I think this lens is overlooked for many reasons. Maybe it's the usability that I just mentioned, and maybe it's the classic look that reminds everyone of a 1920s and 30s lens. But I would also say it's the widest aperture of only f2.8, and I'm guilty of that myself. When I started out shooting film, I was always looking for these special lenses that ideally have an f1 or f1.2 wide open aperture and create that special bokeh and look and so on. And the older I get and the longer I do this here, I realize, okay, actually a solid f2.8 lens is all I need for 98% of my use cases. And in the rare cases where I would need something more, I can maybe still switch lenses or deliberately pick up a different lens and go out with that one if I know I have a particular portrait look that I want to create, or if I know that I won't have a lot of available light, then you might use that. But for all the other cases, a very nice, light and compact 50mm lens is all you will ever need. And it took me a while to come to terms with that, and now that I do, I think this is a very interesting lens. And especially this one here has a beautiful look, at least to my eyes. It's really beautiful. The silver chrome look is perfect. It looks fantastic on the black M's, as mentioned before, and also the silver M's. There's one special thing to note, and that is that the traditional classic lens hood, the so-called 12-580, is compatible with this one and is a perfect match. And in my opinion, it looks particularly beautiful with this combination, and it's also heavily sought after. So if you find the lens with that lens hood, it's perfect. Otherwise, you might have to spend another 60 to 80 euros to have that lens hood and combine it with it. But I think it's definitely worth it. It's a beautiful look, and also the classic lens cap, as in my case, also makes this lens look particularly nice. As always with vintage lenses, I would recommend taking a very close look at it to check for mold and fungus and the internal haze that I've mentioned before. Also check for the glass elements and the focusing mechanism, whether everything is working correctly. Fortunately, these can still be serviced either officially through Leica or many other professionals out there on all different price points, I would say. And this is the kind of lens that definitely retains its resale value, at least so far. It's not particularly expensive, but the price is sticking, and you will still be able to sell the lens again if you intend to do so. And to be completely frank with you, I purchased this lens because it's relatively inexpensive and I just wanted to make a review about it. I was curious about it. I always wanted to have such a vintage Leica lens. And now that I have it, I have a very hard time selling it because I enjoy shooting it so much. So I didn't expect that, to be honest. I just thought it's a curious thing. It's probably, I probably don't appreciate the handling, and I ended up really enjoying it, shooting it a lot on all sorts of different Leica M cameras. And it's a really nice lens to have, in my opinion. Of course, the big question is always, for whom is this kind of lens? It can certainly be a natural addition to any lens collector having a large selection of 50mm lenses already. Adding this one to the collection is reasonable. It can make sense if you have modern spherical Summicrons or even Summilux lenses. Having this low budget Leitz Elmar lens with a vintage rendering is perfect. But I would also argue, if you're just starting out, yes, you can get that classic like a Summicron, and that would always be my recommendation. Go for a Summicron in your preferred focal length. But if you don't have the budget for that, and or want to save first and still be able to use your Leica M body, I would encourage you to also take a look at this particular Leitz Elmar lens here. Get one in great condition or good condition, and then you will have great image results and still get that classic Leica experience of shooting such a lens. Of course, it's even more traditional than just purchasing a Summicron, arguably. And yet it's a really nice lens to have, in my opinion. Yes, the 1 meter minimum focusing distance is a limitation, and yes, you can have an adapter for it. Personally, I wouldn't use it with the adapter, so I would go for the limitation and just live with it. And personally, I also shot this lens a lot wide open, especially with the Monopan 50 film, and I have to say I really enjoy that particular look. It's the kind of lens that you can just put on and leave at a certain aperture and just play around with the shutter speeds and have a lot of fun shooting it as a compact travel lens and for street shots and so on. So overall, this is a lot of value for the money, a lot of optical performance. Yes, there are some quirks. The minimum focusing distance of 1 meter, the turning helicoid and the handling is a bit more challenging, and it takes some getting used to. But once you do, it's a very nice and rewarding experience, in my opinion. So, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and my review of the arguably underrated Leitz Elmar 50mm f2.8 lens. Yes, it looks quite classic, and yes, it might not perform particularly well on digital sensors, and yet if you're like me and just want to shoot it on a film camera, it does offer a surprisingly good performance, a classic rendering, and once you get used to the quirks and the minimum focusing distance of 1 meter, I think it's a very nice lens to have, and it has certainly grown on me, and I find myself repeatedly picking it for street shots, for city trips. As you could see, I used this lens much more than I anticipated, and I set out to purchase it only to sell it afterwards, and it kind of stuck to me and my collection, and I think this is a good sign. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel, Jules Greg, and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.